Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place that takes complex source material. And today, wow, we have centuries of ancient law, philosophy, tragedy, and we try to boil it down to the core story.
And today's story is foundational, really. We're looking at the very origins of social order. It's this huge, often pretty brutal shift from a world governed by private vengeance.
You know, the blood feud.
Exactly. To a world where the state, the emerging polis, tries to grab hold of justice, take it away from individuals and families.
Yeah, and looking through our sources, we've got Aeschylus's plays, Aristotle, Athenian speakers like Demosthenes, even the Roman legal codes.
Yeah.
It seems this wasn't really about high-minded morality at first.
Not primarily, no. It reads much more like sheer necessity, survival. Societies were literally tearing themselves apart with these endless cycles of revenge.
So our mission today is to track that journey.
Mm.
How did these ancient communities even start to define what counted as wrong? And how do they move from, physically hitting back family feuds to using formal language, arguments, courts, all run by this new thing, the state?
That's the core of it, and the central theme, the thing that just screams out from all these different texts, tragedy, law, philosophy. It's this terrifying realization: private vengeance just feeds itself.
It's an infinite loop.
Precisely. Once you start down that path of blood demanding blood, it just leads to chaos. There's no endpoint until some kind of system, something seen as impartial, steps in and says, stop, here. #I. Defining the political foundation of ancient life.
Okay, so to really get this shift to state justice, we need to start with the absolute bedrock of ancient Greek life, the polis. We usually translate it as city or city-state, but the sources are screaming at us that that just doesn't cut it, does it? It's way too thin.
It completely misses the weight of it. Yeah, the polis wasn't just like your local government or where you lived. It was framed as, well, one source calls it the very condition of human existence.
Condition of existence, that's heavy.
It is. To be a proper human being, a functioning moral person in the Greek mindset, you had to live in and be part of a polis. Outside of it, you were diminished. Less than human, almost.
So it's not just geography, it's the entire framework for life. That explains why political things to do with the polis covered basically everything.
Everything. Your family life, how you ran your household, how you interacted with neighbors, religious festivals, war, law. It was all political because it all affected the health and stability of the community.
Politics wasn't like a separate activity you did for a few hours a week.
Not at all. It was the air you breathed. And Aristotle nails this famously when he says, man is a political animal.
Zoon politikon.
Right. And he didn't just mean humans are social, like bees or ants. He meant we necessarily, naturally find our purpose, our morality, our very identity within the structured community of a polis. Without it, you're adrift. You lack the context to be fully human.
Okay, so the polis is the goal, the source of order, meaning everything.
Yeah.
But what about before that state control was fully locked down? When someone gets wronged, what happens then? What's the baseline?
Well, the baseline seems to have been this highly competitive, really decentralized system based on honor, obligation, and reciprocity.
Reciprocity.
Yeah, there was this widely held moral principle, kind of chilling to us now, but absolutely central then. Do good deeds to your friend and do bad deeds to your enemy.
Simple. And brutal.
Very. And if that's your operating system, what does it make revenge?
Not just acceptable, but like a duty, something you have to do.
Exactly. It becomes an active, honorable obligation. If someone harms your family member, your friend, your ally, you are socially, morally required to retaliate. Not doing so meant losing face, showing weakness, betraying your own.
So failing to get revenge wasn't seen as, being peaceful or restrained. It was dishonorable.
Precisely. And that's the terrible trap, because the moment someone acts on that obligation, the system fractures. The concern with revenge, as one text puts it, opens a vista of violence, obligation, punishment, and justice.
A vista of violence. That's quite the phrase. It implies it just keeps expanding.
It does, because the person who takes revenge today, fulfilling their honorable duty,
is the target tomorrow.
Right. It creates this unending spiral. Each act of vengeance necessitates another. There's no built-in off-ramp.
So an offense against one person immediately puts the whole community at risk, not just the families involved.
The stability of the polis itself is threatened. So the challenge for the developing state wasn't just about punishing the first crime. That was almost secondary.
The real goal was
breaking the mechanism of revenge, stopping that automatic, obligatory reciprocity that guaranteed the violence would continue. Crime 2, crime 3, crime 4. indefinitely.
And if you want a visceral sense of just how destructive that cycle was,
Yeah.
you really have to turn to Greek tragedy, Aeschylus's Oresteia trilogy. It's basically the foundational myth about why state law had to happen.
Oh, absolutely. The Oresteia is more than just a story about vengeance. It drags the audience through the emotional and logical nightmare of the blood debt,
Right, it starts with Agamemnon sacrificing his daughter Iphigenia.
which leads his wife, Clytemnestra, to murder him when he returns from Troy.
And then their son, Orestes, is commanded by the god Apollo himself to avenge his father by killing his own mother, Clytemnestra.
It's relentless, and that core tragic pattern is hammered home. The act of taking revenge repeatedly turns the revenger into an object of revenge. There's no escape within the cycle itself.
So Orestes does what Apollo commands. He kills his mother to avenge his father. But does he find peace? Closure?
Not a chance. The moment he commits the act, he's immediately pursued by the Furies, these ancient, terrifying goddesses whose entire existence is about punishing kinship murder. They demand his blood for the blood he spilled.
Just keeps going.
And this terrible logic is summed up in this old proverb they explore in the plays. He who acts is acted upon, or sometimes phrased as the doer suffers.
Action equals reaction, but with blood.
Essentially, yes. Every violent act demands an equally violent response. Vengeance isn't about restoring balance in our sense. It's about exacting its debt. It's this primal scream, let the payment for bloody blow be bloody blow.
That sounds completely inescapable. How does Aeschylus get them out of it? How does society break free if the debt just keeps compounding?
The breakthrough comes in the final play, the Eumenides. And it's revolutionary. The cycle isn't broken by a bigger, badder act of violence.
Well.
No, it's broken by the invention of something new, the establishment of the first homicide court in Athens, the Areopagus, presided over by the goddess Athene.
Ah, okay. So this is the pivotal moment. This is where violence gets channeled into words.
Precisely. The law court, as the text shows, transforms the violence of revenge into the conflict of speeches. The weapon shifts from the sword or the knife to rhetoric, argument, persuasion.
That's the birth of state justice, symbolically at least.
It absolutely is. The court's job is to formalize things, to consecrate social relations of order. It takes the conflict out of the private, bloody, cursed realm of the family feud,
And puts it into the public, structured, rational space of the polis.
where the curse can finally be negotiated, contained, and maybe even resolved.
And what's really striking is how Athene achieves this. She doesn't just impose a verdict with divine force.
No, she explicitly rejects using force. She says there's no need for Zeus's thunderbolt. Instead, she relies on persuasion to convince the Furies to relent, to accept the court's judgment, and transform themselves into benevolent spirits.
So it's the power of reasoned argument, of civic dialogue, winning out over these ancient primal urges for blood.
That's exactly the message. It's a profound statement about the potential of the Athenian democratic project. Athene herself rejoices that the eyes of persuasion were watching over my tongue and mouth, and declares that Zeus of the meeting place, Agora, has triumphed.
Zeus in the agora, the public square, the place for debate.
Yes. The forum for deliberation triumphs over the cycle of vengeance rooted in the family curse. This moment provides the intellectual and mythical justification for the whole idea that organized public speech can replace the need to kill. It's huge. #3. Defining transgression and civic character in law.
Okay, so the Oresteia gives us this powerful mythic origin for law replacing vengeance. But how did that play out in actual Athenian legal practice? Let's shift to Athenian law itself and its concept of hubris. It seems like a really good example of the state defining wrongdoing in a way that protects its own order.
It really is, because hubris, legally speaking, was much more than just, arrogance or pride like we might think of it today.
Right, it wasn't just an attitude problem.
No, it was a specific, legally defined, complex normative repertoire. In practice, it often targeted things like aggressive sexual conduct. But the key was behavior that degrades, dishonors, or insults the victim.
The dishonor part seems crucial, and what really jumps out from the sources is this detail about consent, or rather, the lack of focus on it in the way we'd expect. The law of hubris seemed to operate kind of independently of whether someone technically submitted or not.
That sounds incredibly strange to modern ears, doesn't it?
It does. How does that work?
You have to understand what the law was primarily trying to protect. It wasn't necessarily the individual's bodily autonomy in our sense, but their civic standing, their honor, their teme.
Ah, okay.
So whether the victim submitted under pressure or was physically forced, the hubristic act still dishonored them in the eyes of the community. The core of the crime was the intent to degrade another citizen, to assert power in a way that undermined their social position and, by extension, the stability of the social order. The act of dishonoring was the key violation.
So hubris was fundamentally a political crime then? An attack on someone's status within the polis?
In a very real sense, yes.
Okay.
It showed a dangerous disregard for the established social hierarchy and the dignity expected between citizens. And as you can imagine, this gave Athenian orators a massive opening in the courtroom.
Oh, I bet. Demosthenes and others must have had a field day with this.
Absolutely. The courtroom became this arena for character battles. Orators would seize on alleged acts of hubris to paint their opponents in the worst possible light, playing on all sorts of social anxieties.
Like what?
Well, there was this tension, this ambivalence. Did the alleged hubristic behavior reveal someone's truly base, corrupt moral character, the view pushed by philosophers like Plato or Xenophon?
Yeah.
Or was it just, a sign of aggressive, maybe even admirable high-status masculinity, something you might expect from a competitive, powerful man testing boundaries? Lawyers would fight tooth and nail to frame the act, and thus the man's entire character, according to which interpretation best served their case.
It really shows how quickly Athenian law connected an individual's behavior, their perceived morality, to the overall health and stability of the state. If your character was deemed bad, you were suspect.
That's the absolute core political logic. Once the posis claims that supreme authority, the biggest internal threat is faction, sedition, breakdown from within. The sources are crystal clear on this.
Who's the biggest enemy?
The person who, by permitting a man to power, enslaves the laws and subjects the city to factions, using violence and stirring up sedition contrary to law. That person is the ultimate public enemy.
So the legal system becomes a tool to protect itself, to protect the laws from being undermined by powerful, potentially corrupt individuals.
Exactly. And this meant the community felt it had a right, even a duty, to scrutinize its members, especially potential leaders, based on their perceived nature, their inherent character, and fitness for contributing positively to the polis.
We even see this anxiety pop up in comedy, right?
Yeah.
That weird analogy about coins.
Yeah, the old coin analogy. It's surprising but revealing. The idea was the city had messed up by accepting bad coins men of flawed character and allowing them into circulation, into positions of power, essentially devaluing the whole political currency.
It shows how deeply ingrained this link between personal virtue and public health was.
Deeply, and perhaps the most famous real-world example of this character scrutiny is that epic legal and political battle between the orators, Aeschines and Demosthenes.
Right, they were bitter rivals.
And Aeschines, trying to destroy Demosthenes politically, basically tells the juror, don't listen to how pretty his words are. Look at the man himself. Look at his life.
He urged them to judge the nature and the truth of the speaker, distinguishing between the trustworthy democratic man and the dangerous oligarchic man and low fellow.
Precisely. He said, follow the character of their life, not the character of their speech. It was a blatant appeal to use the legal process as a form of moral policing, arguing that a citizen's fundamental character, their adherence to civic virtue, was the only reliable basis for political trust.
That intense focus on character, on honor, on the power of speech, it feels so quintessentially Athenian. Now, let's make a pretty sharp turn, geographically and conceptually, over to the Roman world. Because when we look at Roman law, the priorities seem really different.
Oh, dramatically different. It's a fascinating contrast. We move from that Athenian world preoccupied with honor, persuasion, and civic virtue to a Roman legal mindset that is much more focused on, well, calculation. Cold, hard calculation.
Less about the soul, more about the spreadsheet.
You could almost say that, yeah. The Roman system, especially as it developed under the empire, seems less invested in the philosophical character of the citizen and much more intensely focused on quantifying damage and assigning liability in a predictable way. The goal feels more like maintaining economic order and predictability.
And the cornerstone for a lot of this, in terms of wrongful damage, is the lex aculia, right?
That's the key piece of legislation here. It established the basic principle that you could sue for the amount of harm you suffered due to someone else's wrongful act. But the crucial part is how they measured that harm.
How did they?
The focus was strictly objective. What is the thing damaged or lost worth to the world at large? Its market value, essentially.
Not its value to me, the owner.
Exactly. This is where Roman law gets quite ruthless in separating emotion from economics. Personal feelings. Completely irrelevant to the calculation.
Can you give an example from the sources?
Yeah, there's a stark one about a slave. Imagine your slave, who happens to be your biological son you deeply care about, is unlawfully killed. You might personally feel he's priceless. You'd pay anything to have him back.
Of course.
But under the Lex Achillea, the court says, nope. We assess the general market price for a slave of that type and skill, your intense personal, emotional value, irrelevant for calculating damages.
Wow. That's cold. But I guess it makes the system predictable.
That seems to be the driving force. Predictability, commercial stability, ensuring that losses could be quantified reliably, regardless of the plaintiff's emotional state. It keeps transactions, even compensation for death, within a calculable framework.
Okay, so this focus on objective calculation, it must have led the Roman jurists to get really deep into the weeds of causation and negligence, right? Who exactly is responsible?
Well, they loved these kinds of problems. They delighted in complex scenarios that tested the boundaries of liability, which brings us inevitably to the famous story of the barber.
Ah, yes, the barber in the public square. Lay it out for us.
Okay, so you have a barber set up, maybe near a place where people play ball, and he's shaving a slave. Someone playing nearby throws or hits a ball, it startles the barber or hits his hand.
Razor slits.
And cuts the slave's throat. Fatal. The big question, under the Lex Achillea, who pays for the dead slave? The barber. The ball player.
My first instinct says the ball player.
Yeah.
He introduced the harmful force.
That seems logical, right? An external accident. But the jurist Proculus had a different take. He argued the blame falls primarily on the barber.
On the barber? Why?
Especially, Proculus says, if the barber chose to set up his stall in a place where people normally played games or where there was heavy foot traffic, basically a place with foreseeable risks.
Because he was negligent in choosing his location.
Precisely. Proculus even adds that the person who entrusts himself to a barber in a dangerous place has only himself to blame for his own misfortune.
Wow, so the victim, or his owner, bears responsibility for choosing a risky service provider.
It shifts the focus dramatically, doesn't it? Away from the immediate cause, the ball, and onto the assessment of foreseeable risk and negligence in setting up the situation in the first place. It's classic Roman pragmatism, thinking about duties of care and assumption of risk.
It really makes you think about responsibility differently. Okay, so beyond negligence in single-cause incidents, how did they handle situations with multiple people causing harm, like a group assault?
They aimed for precision there, too, driven by the need to assign financial liability. Take the case where several people work together to throw a heavy beam and it crushes a slave.
Who's liable?
The jurists generally concluded they all are, under the Lex Achillea. They acted together to cause the harm.
What if it's less clear-cut, like a brawl, and a slave dies, but you can't be sure whose punch or kick was the fatal one?
Ah, another favorite legal puzzle. The jurist Julian tackled this. His opinion was that all the assailants who struck the slave are liable as if they had all killed.
Even if only one blow was fatal, why?
Because under this kind of penal law, payment by one defendant doesn't necessarily release the others from their liability. The goal is to ensure the owner is compensated for the loss, and holding everyone involved liable increases the certainty of that happening. It casts a wide net.
Okay, that makes a certain kind of practical sense, but then they could also get incredibly precise, couldn't they? Distinguishing between, say, wounding and the actual killing blow.
This is where Roman legal analysis gets almost surgically precise, and it really shows their focus on direct causation for the final outcome, the death.
How did that work?
Okay, imagine person A strikes a slave with what is clearly a mortal wound. The slave will die from it eventually, but not instantly. Then, sometime later, before the slave succumbs to that first wound, person B comes along and delivers another blow, maybe finishing the slave off quickly.
Right. So who is liable for the killing? Both.
Here's the Roman legal logic. Person A, who delivered the first ultimately mortal wound, is liable only for wounding.
Only wounding, even though that wound would have killed him.
Yes, because technically, according to this analysis, the slave actually perished from the second wound delivered by person B. Therefore, person B is liable for the killing.
That requires an incredible separation of cause and effect.
It does. It's a stark separation of initial causation from the final, proximate cause of death. The law assigns liability based on who delivered the blow from which the slave actually died, even if an earlier blow made death inevitable down the line. It's this kind of detailed, almost clinical legal calculation that really sets the Roman approach apart from the Athenian focus on honor, character, and persuasion. #V, the maintenance of state order.
So we've seen these two massive shifts, the Athenian move towards persuasion and law courts to break the vengeance cycle, and the Roman focus on calculation and liability to manage harm. Different methods, but the same goal, right? State control over justice.
Absolutely. Replacing that chaotic, destructive system of private revenge with something centralized, predictable, and enforced by the state.
But the sources seem to keep reminding us that just because you establish that system doesn't mean the job is done. It sounds like maintaining that order was a constant struggle.
It absolutely was. This wasn't like flipping a switch and suddenly everyone trusts the state implicitly. The Polis or the Roman state was always, in a sense, on probation. It constantly had to prove its legitimacy and effectiveness otherwise.
People would just go back to the old ways, take matters into their own hands.
Exactly. Factionalism, private vendettas, they were always simmering just below the surface. We see this fragility really clearly in that example from Sparta involving King Pausanias after the oligarchic coup in Athens.
Right. Athens was in turmoil after the 30 tyrants were overthrown. Pausanias intervened.
He did. And crucially, he chose to support a more moderate Pacific party. He deliberately avoided using overwhelming Spartan force to crush one side completely.
Why was that seen as smart politics?
Because it was strategically designed to avoid provoking more hatred, more desire for vengeance between the Athenian factions. A brutal crackdown might have imposed order in the short term, but it would have planted the seeds for future conflict. Pausanias aimed for accommodation, trying to dampen down the cycle of enmity, not escalate it. It shows that even statecraft was about managing the lingering potential for revenge.
So even successful interventions required this delicate touch, constantly aware of the risk of reigniting feuds.
Constantly. The state's authority had to be perceived as final, decisive, and ideally reasonably fair. If it wasn't, if people felt the system was rigged or ineffective, the temptation to revert to private justice would be immense.
And if the state itself was threatened from within by sedition, by attempts to overthrow the legal order, the consequences had to be severe to deter it.
Terrifyingly severe. Look at Plato's theoretical state in his work, The Laws. Sedition was the ultimate crime against the polis.
And the punishment wasn't just for the individual involved?
No, it could cascade through generations. The death penalty was standard for sedition, sure, but Plato outlines a scenario where if a man is condemned for sedition and his father and his grandfather also suffered the death penalty, presumably for similar anti-state activities.
3 strikes and the whole family is out.
Essentially, yes. That entire lineage was deemed incurably corrupted, a poison within the body politic. The living members were exiled, sent away permanently.
And the city just erases them, appoints a new heir for their property and position.
Correct. It's incredibly harsh, but it shows the depth of the fear. Sedition wasn't just a crime. It was seen as a kind of hereditary disease, a fundamental flaw in the family's civic character that threatened the very existence of the polis. The state had to perform radical surgery to ensure its own survival for future generations.
Okay, let's try and pull this together. We've gone on this huge journey from personal vengeance to state justice, whether it's Athenian rhetoric or Roman calculation driving it. And underneath it all, it feels like the primary motive was just survival.
I think that's fair. It was this dawning, desperate realization that the old way, the endless chain of revenge, was collective suicide. They had to find a new technology and law, courts, formal language. That was the new technology to stop the bleeding.
But here's what gets really interesting. As you said earlier, establishing the system is one thing. Maintaining faith in it is another.
That's the perpetual challenge, isn't it? The state constantly has to perform its role convincingly. It has to demonstrate that its justice is, if not perfectly impartial, at least final and authoritative enough to prevent people from thinking, you know what, I could get better justice myself with a knife.
If people believe the courts are just tools for the powerful or just another way for factions to fight,
then the whole edifice crumbles. The logic of private revenge becomes appealing again because the state has failed in its primary function, to definitively settle the score.
So we've traced this arc from the blood-soaked halls of Agamemnon's palace in the Oresteia, where vengeance rules, to the Athenian assembly debating hubris, and finally to the Roman jurist meticulously calculating the price of a lost slave. From blood debt to the conflict of speeches to legal calculation.
It's quite a path. And I think the core takeaway for me, looking across all these sources, ancient or even thinking about today, is that any system of law has this incredibly difficult dual mandate.
Which is?
It has to punish the person who did wrong, obviously. But just as importantly, maybe more importantly for social stability, it has to satisfy the victim and the wider community that justice has been done, that the score is settled, that the state has successfully taken that burning need for retribution out of private hands and resolved it. That's the burden the polis, the state, took on.
Right. That makes sense. Okay, so here's a final thought, something for you, our listeners, to chew on. We saw how the Greeks, particularly in Athens, celebrated the idea that persuasion, the conflict of speeches, could replace the bloody blow of vengeance. That was the ideal, right? The triumph of the agora. But when we look at the sources, we see the political maneuvering of people like Pausanias. We see the intense, vicious rivalries between orators like Aeschines and Demosthenes, who clearly used the courts as weapons to destroy each other politically. It makes you wonder, how often did Athenian democracy, or any system built on rhetoric, truly achieve neutral justice?
That's an uncomfortable question.
Yeah. How often was the court system itself that celebrated triumph of speech actually just a more civilized, more polite, but maybe equally damaging form of political vengeance just wrapped up in legal robes? Something to think about.